Sorry. Welcome to all of you, okay, to this concluding program for the Sunday at the Abbey series for the spring of 2015. We have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Dr. Kathleen Cahalan, who came here to Collegeville in the fall of 2000 and is now a full professor of theology in the School of Theology and Seminary. She teaches courses in the practice of ministry. She teaches the integration seminar where students do a major project and bring it all together in a wonderful practice of integration. That is doing ministry, but thinking about it in terms of, okay, we just spent a whole lot of time learning a lot of theology. How does it all fit? Supported by the Lilly Endowment, I want to say foundation, but it's the endowment. Over the past number of years, Kathleen has been exploring the way that human beings across all fields, professions, and work think about their activity in terms of vocation. And here I'm using that word in an amplified, kind of broad sense. She has distilled interviews with many people from all walks of life and brought this work to written fruition. Kathleen has published a number of books and articles, including the Introducing the Practice of Ministry and Opening the Field of Practical Theology and Introduction. The title of the presentation this evening is The Grammar of Vocation, Changing the Ways We Talk About Our Callings. Please give Kathleen a warm Collegeville welcome.
Thanks, Abbot John. Welcome. Let's start tonight's conversation about vocation with a calling story.
When I think back to in my 20s, I graduated from school and decided to do some volunteer work in South America. The call story that happened occurred there. I was ending my time in Venezuela, working with youth and working with the females in a Christian community. Powerful year. And as I ended that year, I went on retreat along with the American team that I lived with. And at that retreat, we had some free time, and I went out for a walk in the back space of this retreat house. Beautiful. It was a hilltop, and I was walking around, and I was praying, not out loud, but just talking with God as I do, and asking God what was the next step for me. I was 23 and far away, and I had a clean palette for what to do with my life. And in that walk, I did get an idea that I might be called to, don't laugh now, be a Christian singer. I have a good voice and performed all through college. And I was ruminating about that and really wanting God to answer that question. And I did hear a voice which I have not heard since, and I had not heard prior, but it was a voice that was very loud and clear in my heart, which said, "Don't worry, Jane, I'll give you the people you need." And I don't know if someone had been there with the tape recorder, if anyone would have heard anything, but I did know that it was God's communicating to me. And I know because of the fruits of that immediately I was at peace. And it gave me some focus for that next year. After that, doors opened to be an actor, and I kept on getting more success to a certain degree, and it was such a joy-filled calling in some ways to use my skills, which had developed quite well. I guess you just need to be flexible with your calling, which I was.
Her Okay. All right, what are some of the things that you noticed in Jane's story? What are some of the things that stood out for you? Okay, she was praying. Okay. Clean slate. So her life is wide open. She's wondering where to go. She listened. Okay, she was listening. She heard something in her heart. She knew some gifts that she had. She felt a sense of peace, right? What Ignatius would call a sense of consolation, right? Mm-hmm. She was flexible. Okay, so did she get the message she was looking for? Not necessarily, right, right. But she got some assurance, didn't she? That she wouldn't be alone in that journey. Okay, well, as Abbot John said, over the last 6 years, I've been directing a research project at the Collegeville Institute called the Collegeville Institute Seminars. And currently, I have 3 seminars focused on vocation. One on vocation across the lifespan, one on vocation in the professions, and one on vocation and interfaith perspective, so how different religions look at this notion of calling. And these seminars combine people who are in the academy, theologians, psychologists, philosophers, social science, as well as practitioners in the field, primarily people who practice ministry. So the way we went about our research is we read every book in the library about vocation. There's not that many, actually, to be perfectly honest. But then, right away, we started to listen to how people construct their stories of vocation, so a kind of grounded research method. So we started to sponsor groups in congregations here, or, in St. Cloud, and primarily down in the cities, through 2 small group programs, one called Called to Life and Called to Work. And we just asked people about how they experience God's calling. What's a struggle in their life where they've experienced that? How did they know? How did they make a discernment? I suppose we've listened to about 500, 600, 700 people. In addition, we also started to make videos of very exemplary people who could really narrate their story and who would complexify and make vocation seem richer and deeper and harder and more ambiguous than most people think. In addition, we've done about 30 in-depth interviews with people in different professions. So I'd like to share some of that research with you tonight. First, Jane is unique in a number of ways. Most people in our small groups had very limited, mostly non-existent experiences or conceptions of God as a caller. Now, I'm talking about people in Protestant congregations and Catholic parishes. I am not talking about the nuns, who get far more media attention these days. I'm talking about people who go to church pretty regularly and who volunteered to participate in our 6-week program to think about their life as vocation. Jay described his life in terms of many commitments and joys: married life, children, extended family, skills and abilities as a financial analyst, helping people make difficult decisions in their life. He spoke of his role as a father, husband, leader, coach. He had deep gratitude for his life, and he wanted to give back to his community. But at the end of the discussion, he told his group, "But I don't know that I've ever been given a calling." Second, we think that calling has primarily to do with big decisions that we make in young adult life, and we miss the fact that calling has to do with our entire lifespan. When people think about vocation, they tend to think about those young adult years, and there's been a lot of research and a lot of attention given to young adults. Why? Like Jane, they feel like their life is a big blank slate, right? And they have to figure it out. Many young adults in our research had a harder time So we're struggling to align the things that you mentioned, skill, with a place to use that skill, with people to use it with, and with the joy and the goodness that comes from meaningful work. So the start of adulthood is often with aligning those key aspects of vocation. They're anxious, in fact, and also I'd say Doug Skirman in his book on vocation points out that many young adults think that vocation is one thing and that they have to have it all figured out and settled, or there's some sense of failure in their life to do that. But actually they're right on track. They're doing just what they're supposed to be doing in terms of figuring out God's calling. But if we frame vocation solely around young adulthood, we miss other parts of the lifespan. One of the major areas that we found in people's lives was retirement. Retirement ended up to be the major vocational transition of adult life for many, many people. Now, what developmental psychologists are telling us is that obviously we have more longevity, right? We're going to live longer. But we're not going to be older long. We're not going to be elderly longer. We're going to be adults longer. So there's a lot of literature on this area of emerging adulthood and the delayed time that it's taking young adults to figure out some of these life commitments. But now late adulthood is emerging at a time when people, after 20, 30, sometimes 40 years of work, family, building up all those life commitments, are making another transition in which the questions of young adulthood return. Who am I? What am I going to do now? Who are my people? Who am I going to do it with? The three big questions that Sharon Parks notes in her work on young adults. So these questions return throughout the lifespan. Third, we don't really trust our own religious experiences or know how to interpret them. So some people may have experiences like Jane's, but they discount them. They think that's never happened to me, or if it did, it didn't, that's not really what that was. They don't trust their own sense of God's presence in their life. Operatively, the idea of calling remains rather flat and calculating in many people's lives. People too easily think that God has some definite plan for them, and that discernment means figuring out some deeply held secret that God knows and they don't. Yes. In our research, few people had a sense of calling early in their lives, although many had a sense of passion, joy, sense of their gifts, though few had a community that identified and linked those capacities with callings from God. When I was a teen, between my senior year of high school, graduating from high school and going into my first year of college, I thought that God had a calling to me to work with the sick and maybe the dying. But I was young, I didn't know. So I signed up for a volunteer program, and I ended up in North Georgia. I wanted to go to a hospital, but I got placed in a Bible camp teaching children, which I knew was not my gift. So after about the fourth week of the Bible camp, I must have made my displeasure quite obvious to the very nice Franciscan sisters who were leading this endeavor. And the person who was leading our team told me to stay home. That if I wanted to visit the sick, I should take the list of parishioners and I should go visit them. Well, I didn't. I didn't feel able to do that. And so I spent the day doing nothing. And one afternoon I fell asleep. And I had this dream. I heard my name called. Kathleen! And I woke up. And I thought, I got a week left in North Georgia. And I took the keys to the car and the list of parishioners, and I went and visited everybody. Now, what do you notice about that call story? It's in a dream, right? A significant place in the Bible where religious experiences happen. It's just my name. Called by name, that's it. Right. Anything else? I acted on it. Get moving. Get moving was the message. Get off your and get out there. You wanted to figure out what your calling was. Go do it. Go do it. Right. So people can have many, many experiences, but not trust that God's at work in those experiences. My story also shows another problem, and we are not very good at creating communities of calling. Most people don't really have a very strong, in our groups, did not have a very strong sense of what other people's work was in their congregation. They did not foster key practices of discernment, of prayer, or of storytelling, telling each other what God was up to in their lives. Most people make practice vocation as retrospective sense-making. They look back and say, oh, there was God back there doing something. But they had very little capacity to look in now or to look forward, to see what, how God might be calling them in their lives. The majority of people said that their pastors and congregations rarely asked them what their work was, why they did it, how they had come to do it, whether they loved it. Most people were not supported in any way by their work. Young pastor we work with at a tall steeple church in downtown Minneapolis invited business leaders to respond to 3 questions. How does your faith inform you professionally? How does your professional life impact what you do in the community? What do you need your pastors to know about your work? Have you ever experienced a call to what you do professionally? And she heard back from one man, vice president at Piper Jaffray, I think, who said, I have to admit that this is the first time that one of my pastors have ever asked me what I do. Finally, the language of vocation is not very compelling for most people. It's not a very exciting word. In fact, I never really found it very interesting myself as a theologian. And it was while I was writing the book, Introducing the Practice of Ministry, that I just thought, I can't really write a book about ministry without dealing with this idea of vocation. How do people know that they're called into ministry? But I grew up with such narrow Catholic understandings of the term, I just gritted my teeth. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to go over to that library and read some books about it, try to figure this out once and for all. And I was totally wrong, totally and completely wrong. Little did I know that vocation was to become my vocation. That to figure out what this awesome concept, this idea has meant in the Christian tradition and could mean in our lives really got me excited. Much of the surface understanding of vocation that's operative for both Protestants and Catholic portrays a provident, all-powerful deist who makes blueprints for our lives. And we would just like discernment to be like following MapQuest directions. We think vocation's one thing. But frankly, this whole notion of vocation, which got its roots primarily in the 17th and 18th centuries, became pretty hard for many Christians to live by. By the time of World War II, there was a major gathering of theologians, including Karl Barth, that had to work out this notion of providence. Does God plan everything right down to every single detail of our lives, including what I ate for lunch today? Vocation language got wrapped up, though, in that view and that image of God, and many people found it untenable, like theologies of theodicy or suffering. I think vocation got tossed into the trash bin of religious ideas that people just couldn't hold on to anymore. Well, we lost the language of calling. We found in our research, we thought what we were going to find in our research were like outmoded ideas, like Catholics holding on to some idea that vocation was for nuns or priests, or Protestants thinking that vocation had to do with primarily work. That's not what we found. We found nothing. We found people had no idea what the term meant. Do you see, these are 2 different theological problems to respond to. But while we've lost this powerful notion of the divine-human relationship in our language. Others have discovered it and are profiting by it. This is a Google search engine. Google has developed a search engine called Google Ngram Viewer. Can you see it? Which tabulates the frequency of words in about 5 million books. In searching terms like vocation, that's the bottom line, blue, calling, purpose, and meaning, I found that words like meaning and purpose grew in usage from 1900 on, rising steadily up to today. But vocation has and calling has, risen to some extent. But vocation has remained pretty flat and static. The secular culture is retrieving the notion of calling, but theological understandings of it remain slim. Books are marketed everywhere on meaning and purpose, Find Your Personal Renaissance, 12 Steps to Your True Calling, Parker Palmer's well-known books. Even the New York Times, in the business section over the last few years, has had a series called Vocation. You might not see these at the top there. Vocation, the conductor of sea burials. Vocation, the disc jockey. Vocation, quality assurance supervisor. So the New York Times figured out that this was pretty interesting to tell stories tell people's stories about work through this notion of vocation and calling, but churches couldn't figure that out. Actually, the New York Times dropped vocation language, and now the column is what I love. But you see, it's the same idea, right? It's what I'm passionate about, what I've given my life to. It's a very good series. It's buried in the last page of the business section if you're looking for it. So the language of purpose, authenticity, meaning, the true self, identity, composing and constructing a life, these books can be found at every national bookstore chain, not only in popular literature, but in the social sciences as well. Calling has great interest. One of my colleagues, Matt Bloom, a psychologist who works at Notre Dame, is writing a lot about calling and work, and says there's a growing consensus that calling comprises work that people can express their true self, meet important societal needs, is not just viewed as an end in itself. And such language has really deep sources in our culture, which I could spend a lot of time talking about, but certainly most recently in the romantic philosophies of the 19th century. But how can calling be language about the Christian life that doesn't fall immediately into ideas about self-fulfillment or self-actualization, leaving aside the radical call of the gospel to really give up our lives, right? Or how could we critically reclaim some of the key interpretations of calling and vocation from our tradition and leave behind some of the really unhelpful ideas that have not helped people practice vocation well? Well, what would vocation look like if we reframed it? Okay, a short grammar lesson. We primarily talk about vocation as a noun, a thing, and it ends up fairly static. We're searching for an object, one that is already constructed. If God would just tell me what my vocation is, right? And we tend to think that it's singular, it's one thing. In fact, vocation is quite multiple. We have callings, many callings in our life. What if we frame vocation as a verb? It becomes a lot more active. God shouted at me. God whispers to other people. God pushes. God pulls. God calls. God guides. Verbs are more active. They're more dynamic. But in my grammar study, I realized that if you frame vocation around prepositions, the idea of calling becomes more relational, more dynamic, more ongoing, more evolving. It's not set in stone once and for all. It's something that's happening in your life. Rather than portraying God as creating us with a vocation, something we possess, why not understand God as creating us for vocation, a relational capacity for responding to God's call, something we're doing? in that relationship. So I've been playing with 8 prepositions that I'll briefly summarize for you, maybe spend a little bit more time on depth on a few. Let's start with by. That's the most obvious one. The whole foundation of vocation language is to say that we're called by God. But it really matters what you think and how you imagine who God is and how God calls. In our research, I say there's been 3 primary images or metaphors that have arisen, and in the reading that I did. The first one is the acorn. As I said, many people think that vocation means that God has a plan for them and that their job is to figure that out. However, only a very few people in our research actually experience God as having a plan for them. I like to call this the acorn experience. Some people do experience their calling like an acorn. There's only one thing an acorn can become, and that's a oak tree. That's right. So a few people had a sense from childhood that they knew exactly what their life was to be, and that is really awesome. The problem, for example, I'll give you one example. One example is Margaret O'Gara, the late Margaret O'Gara, who some of you know well. She's a board member at the Collegeville Institute, a great friend of the Abbey and the School of Theology. And when she was on sabbatical here several years ago, we were having lunch, and somehow we got talking about how we became theologians and how we knew we wanted to be theologians. And she told me that she knew since the age of 6 that God was calling her to be a reformer of the church. And I think anyone who knew Margaret, you're all shaking your heads, knew that she lived that calling out up to the day that she died a few years ago. Yeah, but not everybody has that sense of calling, and though it's a dominant interpretation of vocation, a lot of times it can make people feel like they want to be so sure and so definite as Margaret. They want their calling to feel like the acorn, but they just can't find the nut. They just can't, it just doesn't work, right? Yeah, it's not like that. The most predominant image of being called by God is as a pilgrim. Pilgrimage actually ends up to be a better metaphor for some people, a more powerful image, more true to their experience. What's a pilgrimage? Who's been on a pilgrimage? What's it like? You got a destination in mind? You think you're going to get there on a straight path? No? Yeah? Do you take some wrong turns? Yeah? You only figure it out by walking, right? You only figure it out by getting on the path. Some people have a hunch, a feeling, this might be a good choice for me. I think I'll try this. Oop, I think I'll take a different turn. That wasn't so good, right? Let's look at another story. Some of you will recognize this person who found their I got to get started exactly. You don't have 7 minutes to listen to.
Press as a stepping stone. It was a transition. It was never going to be permanent. I didn't want it to be permanent. And I've now been there for almost 6 years. And for the first 3 or 4 years, every year, every spring, I would say to my supervisor, all right, this year I'm going to go on for graduate school. This year I'm going on for graduate school. And finally, I decided instead of graduate school, I had discerned that I was going to join the monastery where I had been at college, and had told the community that I needed a year to kind of get things here in order and to help my boss find a replacement for me and to really take time to discern that calling. And throughout that year, I grew more and more unsettled with the idea of leaving Minnesota, leaving my work, leaving the life that I have created here. And my boss and I were talking one day, and I thought, well, maybe this is my calling. Maybe editing and being an editor and working in publishing is where I need to be. And it was again that sense of peace that this is right here, right where I'm supposed to be, and I don't need to move out of it.
So Lauren, who maybe many of you recognize, really points to this discovery along the way, that she thinks something is just a transition in her life. But then she discovers in it, I'm staying here. This is a calling for me. I'm going to do this work of editing and publishing. A third image that I found, I'm calling the surprising discovery. It happens when you maybe least expect it and kind of comes like a jolt or a spark, but it has significant ramifications. Oh, I was going to show you another story here.
It's been a lifelong desire to do different things with wood. And I, as a young boy, would spend time walking through the woods and looking at the trees and trying to imagine what they were like in size and which ones I would cut up and use for lumber later. I didn't realize at the time how important that was to me. It was later in life that I look back and I say, wow, that's where it all started. And I would take my mother's peach crates and I would pull them apart and figure out different little things I could make out of them, toys or buildings. You know, all I had was a little hand saw maybe and a hammer and some nails, but I got pretty creative with what I could do with it. There was always that desire to do something with wood. In high school, I took a wood class and I was just fascinated by what I could do making a simple breadboard. Just fascinated the heck out of me. Later in life, I took a class on whittling, and this was when after I had gotten married, and I was teaching in a high school, and it was an evening class, and all we had to do was cut little notches on a piece of wood the first night. And I remember coming home and sitting there at the table, cutting these notches on the wood, just trying to get them all even, and getting used to using a knife and a piece of wood. And I was so excited. It was like my spirit was just jumping inside with, you found it. You finally found it. This is what you want. This is what you are to do. But at the time, I figured, well, this will be just like I tried to learn how to play guitar and I tried to learn how to play tennis, and it would last for a few months and die off. But this never died. It just kept growing and growing, and people would give me encouragement. Basically, it took off by itself, and I just kept feeding it and ended up where I am today.
So the sense of vocation or calling as a discovery. Ken really had this skill and capacity and had practiced it since childhood, but then as an adult, it's just his spirit leaping inside him. Isn't that a great image? So here are some images of God as a very dynamic caller. God as the artist, God as the pilgrim walking with us, as the searcher, as the gift giver, even God the planner is there, right? So threaded through these stories, I realized that we're called by God through conversations with other people, by trying out different jobs and areas of study, by realizing what we don't want to do, by looking back at our lives, by seeing a plan, by following a way. Most people connect vocation language with the preposition to. God is calling me to get married, to religious life, right? To graduate school at St. John's or something, right? So that's the big one. This is the one we're really looking for. So I'm just going to spend a couple seconds on it. Generally, in the Christian tradition, this goes back to Luther. Luther was really our patron saint of vocation, and we owe a lot of good theology to him. But he had the idea that we're called to the Christian life as a general calling, and we're called to the Christian life in our particular callings. And what he meant by that was that our baptism calls us to the same vocation. We all share the same life in Christ by being part of this body. That's our fundamental claim as Christians, right? That's first and foremost, before any other calling. But then each of us experiences particular callings in our life, many of them. And for him, remember, Luther just blew open this notion of vocation. Every person, every Christian, he said, experiences God's call in the place that they are, wherever they are. You know, the father changing the diapers babies, he says, or the cobbler who's making shoes. They experience God's call to love their neighbor, to love God in that place. So he had a real way of connecting general and particular callings. And I find that language really useful for retrieving a notion of vocation today. The second way is Christian theologians also have a very strong sense that we are called to be our true selves. So while secular culture certainly uses language of true self, false self, you've got to discover who you are, Christian theologians also have been using this language a lot. Thomas Merton used it, if you're a Merton reader, used it quite a bit, that there's that God creates a true self, that our journey of faith is to discover who that person is. Parker Palmer uses this language in a very strong way, as does John Neefsey. So what I hear them saying is that at some point on our journey, we discover that there are callings in our life that we cannot not do. It's so true to who I am. I can't do otherwise. I have to give my life to that. So that is an important dimension of calling. Doesn't come always to the young. It can come later. But certainly Jim Foley, the photojournalist who was killed by ISIS, experienced this when he told his mother, "I have to go back. This is a vocation for me." He went to Marquette. This is a vocation for me. I have to tell these people's stories. So that's a good example, I think, of how this language of I'm called to discover my true self. As, my third preposition. So this pushes Luther's idea of particularity even further because, theologians are very conscious today of the contextualization of religious ideas and thought. And what's so exciting about theology of vocation today is that it really pays attention to particularity. God calls me as I am. As I am. I changed my name after that dream. When I went to college that fall, I had always been Kathy. But when I enrolled, I signed my name as Kathleen, which is my baptismal name. So my name means a lot to me. And when people use it, I hear a deep resonance of that I'm being called by name, as I am. I'm a white middle-class woman born in the late 20th century. I got these parents, right? I married this husband. I had some options, but I married that one. And I teach at St. John's. I didn't take the job at Santa Clara. My life gets lived out in the particularities, right? The choices I've made, the commitments I've made, even the things I don't get to choose very much of, right? So my life, my callings do look different than Patty's, right? Even though we share a common calling in our life. So as I am. As also pertains to lifespan. And that means that children have callings as children. Teens have calling as teens. Teens are not just getting ready to be adults or young adults. And young adults are not just getting ready to be middle adults. No, they're being called as young adults. So a lot of the work we've been doing is thinking about how calling impacts both our sense of our bodies, particularly in aging, as well as in time. From. Sometimes callings end. Sometimes callings end. Sometimes God is calling us from someone, from somewhere, right? From some place, from something. Yes? Yeah, obviously God calling us away from sin, but even more than that, callings do end. We may have a sense in our life that we know better that God is calling us from something than what the to is, right? Do you have a sense of that? Yeah. So God calls us in our grieving and in our losses. 4. Michael Himes, Jesuit at Boston College, says that vocation is figuring out, my calling is figuring out what my gifts, what my life is for. Essentially, at the heart of Christian understandings of calling is that God did not give me all this just for myself, right? I am meant to give my gifts, give of myself for others. So Heim gives his students 3 questions to answer. Is this a source of joy in your life? Is this joyful? What are your gifts? What are you, does this really tap into, what you're good at? And does anybody need it? Is this a genuine service to others? So he says, do you get a kick out of it? Are you any good at it? And does anybody want you to do it? Those are good questions of discernment. Well, we've been working a lot on, missing a picture here. We've been working a lot on this idea of calling in relationship to the professions. And by that, I mean any area of work. Being a carpenter, being a financial analyst, being a grade school teacher, being a plumber. It doesn't matter to me the area of work. Partly, obviously, most of you know in this room, vocation got all wrapped up in the profession to ministry, which I care a lot about. But one of my own conversions in working on this question was when I really awakened to the idea that the call to ministry is the call to nurture all the vocations in the community, all the work, relationships, commitments, marriages, single life, that people live and have. That's what ministers primarily should be spending their time doing. Well, why this link between professions and vocation? Professions are a very interesting way in which work has been organized for a long time in Western society. So we could talk a lot about that. But what's interesting is at the root of the notion of professions is the word to profess, to make a promise, to use your knowledge, your skills, right, for the well-being of another. So think of a doctor, think of a teacher, you've been given these skills, you have a special knowledge, you go to school, you get a certificate, they tell you you can practice something, right? But the whole impetus is that you do this for the well-being of another person, not for self-gain. So I see in the long legacy of professions in Western society a way to link, to connect this deep notion of vocation, because it connects our sense of calling to the common good, right? To the whole world, to the whole society, to the upbuilding of God's people and God's world. There's lots of books written about professions, and I love this quote by Dorothy Sayers. She said, the church is just always telling the carpenter not to be drunk and disorderly and to come to church on Sundays, when what they really should be telling the carpenter is that he should make good tables, right? That's what God has given him to do. In the last 50 years, however, only 2 books have been written that link vocation and professions. One by a Lutheran back in the 1960s, and one by James Martin, if you know the Jesuit who works for America Magazine, wrote a little compilation book called Professions of Faith. Theologians, some pay attention to work, not a lot. But social scientists, economists, philosophers, the literature on work and labor in our society is enormous. But we've given very little attention to this. But this is what people do every day with their lives, isn't it? So I'm going to show you one more story. Of someone who has a keen sense of calling in her profession.
Everything I've done, it's sort of like it just happened. I don't remember planning for things. They just sort of showed up on my doorstep. I took a class at school, independent study in accounting. Never took an accounting class in high school, bookkeeping, had no idea what it was about. I thought, oh, here's a class, it's independent study, that's easy, I don't have to go to class, I'm good at working on my own. I don't have to be with all those people, so I go to class, I take the pre-test, and I fail horribly because I don't know anything about accounting. So I have to go to class. So I go to class, and all of a sudden, it all makes sense to me. And that was where I belonged. Accounting is like a jigsaw puzzle. I always grew up liking jigsaw puzzles, and so there's a sense of accomplishment in what I was doing. Once it clicked what a debit versus a credit was, it was business-based. My dad had his own business. It just felt right. It felt like I was where I was supposed to be. What I'm really good at, I believe, is reading the story, figuring out what the story is that the numbers tell you, and problem solving. It seems to come to me naturally. I can look at a set of financial statements and figure out what the message is, or people can present a problem, and to me, problems are just opportunities to solve. They're not bad things that you have to get rid of. What's most meaningful to me about my work is that I can see the light go on when somebody gets it. When you explain something, it seems like I'm always educating or teaching, learning myself, but also teaching as I go along, no matter what it is. So what I've always done at work is teach. And what I've taught is how to interpret or tell the story that accounting provides you in the financial statements. So my role has always been, here's a user, they need financial statements to help them understand what they're doing. I can translate that into English. I can take this accounting business language, translate it into English. Most people are terrified because they think it's numbers. And they think it's numbers, and they think back to word problems in 3rd or 4th grade, and then they hated math after that, and so therefore they aren't going to like accounting, there's too many numbers, and therefore they don't understand their statements. But their statements are how they make decisions. Their statements provide them the information to do the work they're doing, so it should be there as a source of help, not as an element of fear.
Okay, I think this is my 6th preposition, right? Through. You know, if God calls us for each other, God definitely is calling us through each other. We heard lots of stories from people about how parents, teachers, and work supervisors either negatively impacted their journey of calling or positively impacted. And the negative stories are always pretty sad. I'm not going to tell you all of them. I'll even skip most of them. But generally they have to do with people discounting that a person's desire or hope or what they want to do is authentic or good for them. Oftentimes adults act like they know better than a young person about what they really want or what they dream for. Some people were told that the best thing, particularly men, were told that the best thing to do was to find a job that made them some money. And so they relinquished or let go of a dream or a passion or a hope or some gift that they really wanted to pursue. You know, those people that positively found something generally had adults in their life that recognized, encouraged, helped them pursue even their wildest dreams. Okay, so through. Whoops. And the seventh preposition is in. Sometimes God calls us in the place that we are. And here I'm retrieving Luther's notion of in. So Luther obviously was a medieval Christian, right? And he didn't live in a society that had a lot of movement. It was pretty static socially, right? So if you were born a cobbler, you were going to be a cobbler, right? If you were born a woman, you were going to get married or go to the convent, right? You didn't have a lot of choice. And one of the problems with contemporary theologies of vocation is it looks pretty white and middle class. In other words, it looks like vocation is all about choice. It's all about, well, I just get to choose what college I'm going to go to or who I'm going to marry or, you know, what kind of retirement I'm going to have, what kind of service or volunteer work that I want to do. And much of our life consists actually of figuring out God's calling in those places where we do not have choice. We have to figure out what is this calling beyond any choice that I have. And so in our research, we've looked at any number of experiences. Unemployment is a big one. When you feel that the work that you've done is really meaningful and good and you lose a job. Or underemployment, what many immigrants experience, having skills. This is Francois, one of our videos of, he was trained as a sociologist at home in Nigeria, and when he came to America, of course, he had to take a job as a dishwasher. So underemployment, chronic illness. This is a story of a couple, the husband has Alzheimer's. You know, it's not of his own choosing. It's not of their own choosing. That's not how they plan to live these years out of their life. What does it mean to ask the question of calling in their situation? And finally, my last preposition is within. That points to the two great mysteries of the Christian faith, that God comes to dwell within our midst, right? That the kingdom of God is within you, Luke says, and that God calls each of us to abide within the one holy mystery. Even in our death, Henry Nouwen says, God calls us within. God calls us within the holy divine life. Many of our callings end at our death, but Nouwen saw dying as a great opportunity to respond to God's calling. So in this presentation tonight, I've tried to do several things. Most people, I said, had limited or almost non-existent experiences or conceptions of God as a caller. And I'd like to expand our imaginations about how God calls us and how we can experience that calling. Nudging us gently beyond beyond the noun, to think more in terms of verbs and prepositions. And through prepositions, to think of our whole life, that callings embrace our whole life long, and that involves a dynamic and evolving relationship with God and each other. I said that most of us think that calling is getting it all right in our young adult years. But callings are multiple, and they reach all across our life. I said that we don't trust our own religious experience or know how to interpret it. I said that the language of vocation is not very compelling for most of us. And I said that we don't really have communities of calling. Jack Fortin said that the church needs to become a community of calling where we foster the key practices of discernment and prayer and storytelling, where we encourage each other to tell each other our stories of how God is calling us in our life. Now, I've told you many stories tonight, some from my own life and lots on our videos. So I'd like you to take a moment before you leave tonight and invite somebody else to tell you their story of how God's calling them in their life. Thank you.
Some questions?
Yeah.
So we have 3 mics. If you'd like to pose a question or make an addition.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. My name is Tom, and question I have is related to, you said that vocation is not something that's treated in dramatic or in much depth in theology, but sociology and many other areas of business. I mean, I'm sorry, work. So when we talk about work, how does your findings relate to their thoughts about this idea of a work ethic, of a demand and related to work being an imperative that's not a calling, but is something that's a cultural dimension that maybe is pressure, that people have pressure to do. There's a certain amount of internal pressure as opposed to a calling from above. That's more of a secular idea.
Well, there's an economic pressure to work, right? So as far back as Genesis, labor is about, we have to sustain our lives in some ways. So, right, work is a very big category. We work for lots of different reasons. Not all work is experienced as a calling. Many people work to support their families and find that their callings are in other things, doing other things. So I don't think that we should collapse the two. I like people to tell me if they experience their work as a calling. I don't like to say that, all work is a calling or, yeah. Does that kind of help make that distinction a little bit? Mm-hmm.
Kathleen, I'm Brother Paul Vincent. I was absolutely thrilled to hear you talk about children, young people, as living out a vocation, as being very valid. When do I start living? Well, as I work with high schoolers and even younger people, and they need to hear that more than once, because I don't think they're not really terribly brought up in an environment that supports that.
Right.
I think our prep school is a little bit of an exception, but I think in general, you start living after you maybe graduate from college. I don't know.
I don't think so. Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah, children and particularly infants really push our notions that callings are highly conscious, rational, deliberate, right? Choices. They really push against that, but they really open up a relational understanding, and they show us the way in which we call each other, so that the infant calls forth the mother and the father to be a parent, and the parent calls the infant into their personhood. So it's deeply relational. Same thing with grandparents, right? The grandmother becomes a grandmother, right, by the child calling forth that in them. So it shows that deeper relationality. Yeah. Lois?
I think right along with that is, wait until you get into the real world.
Yeah, this is right.
I think you are in the real world.
This is your world. Yeah, yeah, yeah. God calls you in the place that you are. So, yeah, Luther's idea. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Tom?
When I was trying to discern where I was going, I used the language of duty because that was the language my father had.
Sure.
And it was a much safer word to use than calling. And in some sense, it's still safer, but I'm wondering if you'd like to talk about the difference between those ideas.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good point. I should have raised this with my preposition in, because certainly God calls us in these obligations, these duties, these responsibilities that we have. And so I think I'm just using another term there. Yeah, but there are things that we have to do that maybe we would not otherwise choose to, or we don't really want to, or we don't really like to, but it's about the nature of the commitments that we make. So I do think that duty and obligation language come also as a part of the adult commitments that we make. And certainly people who are caregivers feel a sense of, I didn't choose this, this isn't what, but I have to do this. So, yeah. But you felt that even when you went to the Peace Corps. Tom went to Peace Corps twice. Is that me? Oh. But you felt... You a zookeeper. You have a college degree, but you don't get paid much money. Most zookeepers have to literally clean out cages. It's very difficult, demanding physical work. But they did it because they felt so obligated, such a deep ethical responsibility to care for animals. And anyway, so it's a very interesting study, but it pointed out, and these sociologists were really quite surprised to find this ethic of obligation or of responsibility at the heart of what these zookeepers do. Another question? Yes. Mm-hmm.
This may follow in the same direction that you're just talking about, but you used the word through, and I was wondering through other people and one thing after another, sure. But you stayed away from the word obedience, and I was wondering how you connect obedience in some of these things, because I'm sure in your marriage, the two of you have done things that because he needs it done or you need it done, whether I want to do it or not, duty or obligation or whatever you want to call it. But
it's never happened to us.
Yeah. Whatever the terminology of obedience.
Well, I think obedience means listen, doesn't it, in this tradition?
Is what?
Means listen, doesn't it? Roger? You can say it from there, Roger.
I'll bet I could. But I'm trying to be obedient. Yes, thanks, Kathleen, for this. It causes me to be very thoughtful and very grateful about so much. You led us through several ways of looking and thinking and feeling, I suspect, about our own callings, or not. Back earlier, when you were still talking about using verbs, before you got to those little words, I thought, I can remember all kinds of words that if I look back, I say, yes, sir, God irked me, God pushed me, God interfered with me. You didn't use very many of those negative experiences.
I got
that
them all in there.
black. You got
I got
them
them
all
all in there, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because often being called from something
Yeah.
demands the language of lament.
Yeah, because
Right?
it's
You're not happy.
a
You
lot
don't
of things
really-
a lot of things I wanted to do, and I was happy doing them. They got interfered with.
Yeah. So I think my preposition from kind of captures these really painful things that we have to let go of, and that we might, shake a fist back at God. Yeah.
Let's put our hands together for Kathleen.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very, very fine, thoughtful presentation, Kathleen. Thank you as an audience for being here and for participating in this wonderful event. There are wonderful cookies and some coffee, caffeine, and decaf there. Please eat much.